introduction. Thank you.
Hello, we're live in London to hear Prime Minister David Cameron's wish list to Britain's European partners. He's launching his efforts to reform the European Union in order to keep Britain in the bloc. Let's listen in.
21st century. I argued that Britain's best future lay within a reformed European Union if the necessary changes could be agreed. And I promised the British people that if I was re-elected as Prime Minister, we would have an in-out referendum and the final say on whether our national and economic security is better protected by remaining in the European Union or by leaving. That promise is now being honoured. The law of the land will require that there must be a referendum on our EU membership by the end of 2017. The renegotiation is now entering its formal phase following several rounds of technical discussions. And today I'm writing to the President of the European Council, setting out how I want to address the concerns of the British people and why I believe that the changes that Britain is seeking will benefit not just Britain, but the European Union as a whole. Now, it would, of course, be for the negotiation itself to conclude the precise legal changes needed to bring about the reforms that Britain needs. But today I want to explain in more detail why we want to make the changes we've set out and how they'll make a difference. This is perhaps the most important decision that the British people will have to take at the ballot box in our lifetimes. So I want to set out for the British people why this referendum matters and some of the issues we should weigh up very carefully as the arguments ebb and flow as we approach the referendum. And I want to explain to our European partners why we're holding this referendum, what we're asking for, and why. Since I made that speech almost 3 years ago, the challenges facing the European Union, they've not diminished, indeed they have grown. The economic outlook may be somewhat brighter, but the legacy of the Eurozone crisis endures. The threats to our security and to the security of every European nation have grown enormously in the last few years, from the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine to the emergence of ISIL and the migration flows triggered by the war in Syria. And across Europe, the rise of parties of protest demands a response. But nothing has happened, nothing has undermined or rendered obsolete the central argument that I set out in my speech at Bloomberg. If anything, it's reinforced it. The European Union needs to change. It needs to become more competitive to cope with the rise of economies like China and India. It needs to put relations between the countries inside the euro and those outside it, like Britain, onto a stable, long-term basis. It needs greater democratic accountability to national parliaments. Above all, it needs, as I said at Bloomberg, to operate with the flexibility of a network, not the rigidity of a bloc. Never forget that the European Union now comprises 28 ancient nations of Europe. That very diversity is Europe's greatest strength. Britain says, let's celebrate that fact. Let's acknowledge that the answer to every problem is not always more Europe. Sometimes it's less Europe. Let's accept that one size does not fit all. That flexibility is what I believe is best for Britain, and as it happens, best for Europe too. Doing what is best for Britain drives everything I do as your Prime Minister. That means taking the difficult decisions and sometimes making arguments that people don't much want to hear. It's why we've taken the difficult but necessary action to reduce the deficit. It's why we're seeing through our long-term economic plan. It's why we're reforming welfare and education. Because we know that the bedrock of our security is a strong economy, and that these are the things any nation must do to succeed in the 21st century. It's also why, despite all the pressures on the public finances, we've guaranteed to spend 2% of our economy on defence, and why we're spending 0.7% of our gross national income on overseas aid. With that money, we're able to equip our armed forces with 2 brand new aircraft carriers, to double our fleet of drones, to buy new fighter aircraft and new submarines, and to invest in our special forces. We're doing all of these things to protect our economic and our national interest. And that is the prism through which I approach our membership of the European Union, taking the tough decisions, making the difficult arguments, addressing the issues that no one wants to talk about, and protecting and advancing our economic and national security. Like most British people, I come to this question with a frame of mind that is practical, not emotional, head, not heart. I know that some of our European partners may find that disappointing about Britain, but that is who we are. That's how we've always been as a nation. We're rigorously practical. We are obstinately down to earth. We are natural debunkers. We see the European Union as a means to an end, not an end in itself. Europe where necessary, national where possible, as our Dutch friends put it. An instrument to amplify our nation's power and prosperity, like NATO, like our membership of the UN Security Council or the IMF. We understand that there's a close relationship between the security and prosperity of the continent to which our island is tied geographically and our own security and prosperity. And in the week when we commemorate the end of the Great War, and in the year when we've marked the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Europe, how could we not? Britain has contributed in full measure to the freedom that Europe's nations enjoy today. Across the continent, from Ypres to Monte Cassino, from Bayeux to Arnhem, in stone-cold cemeteries lie the remains of British servicemen who crossed the Channel to help subjugated nations throw off the tyrant's yoke and return liberty to her rightful place on what Churchill called this noble continent. And today we continue to play our full role in European security and in global security, fighting Ebola in West Africa, flying policing missions over the Baltic states, contributing to NATO operations in Central and Eastern Europe, saving lives and busting the people-smuggling rings in the Central Mediterranean, spending £1.1 billion on aid to the region of Syria, Lebanon and Jordan, more than any other European nation. Britain has always been an engaged nation because we know that engagement is the best way to protect and advance our economic and our national security. So today, as we confront fresh threats and dangers to our country, I'm in no doubt that for Britain, the European question is not just a matter of economic security, but of national security too. Not just a matter of jobs and trade, but of the safety and security of our nation. Equally, when Europe and the European Union accounts for almost half of our trade, it matters for our economic security that the European Union is competitive and succeeds in promoting prosperity for its members. Just as it matters to us that while we're not part of the euro, and in my view never will be, the Eurozone is able to deal with its problems and to succeed. If it fails to do so, we will certainly not be immune from the side effects. That is why, almost 3 years ago, I set out the case for reform that would benefit Britain and, in my view, benefit the entire EU. I was clear that Britain gains advantages from her membership of the EU, but I was also clear that there are some major problems which need to be addressed. Political leadership means confronting these problems, not wishing them away. If we ignore them, history teaches us they will only get worse. Let me explain what I mean. In my Bloomberg speech almost 3 years ago, I said the European Union faced three major challenges. First, the problems in the Eurozone. They need to be fixed, and that will require fundamental changes. Second, a crisis of European competitiveness as other nations across the world soar ahead and Europe risks being left behind. And third, a gap between the EU and its citizens, which has grown dramatically in recent years, and which represents a lack of democratic accountability and consent that is felt particularly acutely here in Britain. These three challenges are as critical now as when I first set them out. And today I would add a fourth. As we've seen so spectacularly across Europe with the questions posed by the migration crisis, countries need greater controls to manage the pressures of people coming in. And while in Britain we're not part of the Schengen No Borders Agreement, and so we've been able to set out our own approach and take refugees directly from the camps, we do need some additional measures to address wider abuses of the right to free movement within Europe and to reduce the very high flow of people coming to Britain from across all of Europe. So the changes we're arguing for are substantial, but they have a very clear purpose to address the 4 key challenges which are vital to the success of the European Union and to maintain and advance the UK's economic and national security within it. Now let me explain each of them in turn. First, it's in all our interests for the Eurozone to have the right governance and structures to secure a successful currency for the long term. Britain understands that, and we won't stand in the way of those developments as long as we can be sure that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that our own interests are fully protected. Let me explain what I mean. There are today 2 sorts of members of the European Union. There are Euro members and non-Euro members. The changes which the Eurozone will need to implement will have profound implications for both types of member. So non-Euro members like Britain, which are outside the Eurozone, need certain safeguards in order to protect the single market and our ability to decide its rules, and to ensure that we face neither discrimination nor additional costs from the integration of the Eurozone. Because the European Union and the Eurozone are not the same thing. And those of us who are in the EU but outside the Eurozone need that accepted. We need a British model of membership that works for Britain and for any other non-Euro members. And this should be perfectly possible. The European Union is a family of democratic nations whose original foundation was, and remains, a common market. There's no reason why the single currency and the single market should share the same boundary any more than the single market and Schengen. So the EU needs flexibility to accommodate both those inside and outside the Eurozone, both those who are contemplating much closer economic and political integration, and those countries like Britain which will never embrace that goal. Now, this is a matter of cardinal importance for the United Kingdom, because if the European Union were to evolve into a single currency club, where those outside the single currency are pushed aside and overruled, then it would no longer be a club for us. We need this issue fixed so that the UK is not obliged to fight a series of running battles which would only corrode trust amongst member states. And we have to make sure that there's a point to being in the EU but not in the Eurozone, and that that position does not turn a country into a rule taker instead of a rule maker. And now is the time to do that. So as part of our renegotiation, I'm asking European leaders to agree clear and binding principles that protect Britain and other non-Euro countries, and a safeguard mechanism to ensure that those principles are respected and enforced. Those principles should include the following: recognition that the EU is a union with more than one currency, that there should be no discrimination and no disadvantage for any business on the basis of the currency of their country, that the integrity of the single market must be protected, that as the Eurozone moves ahead, any changes it decides to make, like creation of a banking union, for instance, must be voluntary for non-Euro countries, never compulsory, that taxpayers in non-Euro countries should never bear the cost for operations to support the euro as a currency, and that just as financial stability and supervision has become a key area of competence for the Eurozone and institutions like the ECB, so financial stability and supervision is also a key area of competence for national institutions, like the Bank of England, for non-Euro members. And of course, that any issues that affect all member states must be discussed and decided by all member states. So second, we want a European Union that adds to our competitiveness, not detracts from it. Now, I've already made good progress here since my speech at Bloomberg. Legislative proposals under the new Commission have fallen by 80%, with more regulations set to be repealed this year than in the whole of the previous Commission. We have proposals for a capital markets union, which will help get finance into the hands of entrepreneurs and growing businesses. The new plans to deepen the single market in services and digital will mean new opportunities for millions of British businesses to operate more easily anywhere in Europe. Changes we secured just last month will mean that British tourists will no longer incur roaming charges when they use their mobile phones or have to pay extortionate credit card fees. And just last month, the European Commission published a new trade strategy that reflects the agenda that Britain has been championing for years, including pursuing massive trade deals with America, China, Japan, and ASEAN. We know the benefits that free trade can bring. Recent deals, including one with Korea, are already saving UK consumers £5 billion every year. And they've helped UK car exports, for instance, to Korea increase fivefold. But there's much more that we can do. For all that we've achieved in stemming the flow of new regulations, the burden from existing regulation is still too high. Now, 2 years ago, we secured the first ever real terms cut in the EU budget. It's now time to do the same with EU regulation. So we need a target to cut the total burden on business. And at the same time, we need to bring together all the different proposals, promises and agreements on the single market, on trade, on cutting regulation, bring them all together into one clear commitment that writes competitiveness into the DNA of the whole European Union. Now, third, we need to deal with the disillusionment that many of Europe's citizens feel towards the European Union as an institution. And these concerns are not just in Britain, but they are perhaps greater here than anywhere else in the European Union today. Now, we've already passed a law to guarantee that no powers can transfer from Britain to Brussels ever again without the explicit consent of the British people in a referendum. But if Britain is to remain in the EU, we need to do more. And really, it boils down to this. We are a proud, independent nation. We intend to stay that way. So we need to be honest about this. The commitment in the treaty to an ever closer union is not a commitment that should apply any longer to Britain. We don't believe in it. We do not subscribe to it. We have a different vision for Europe. We believe in a flexible union of free member states who share treaties and institutions, working together in a spirit of cooperation to advance our shared prosperity and to protect our people from threats to our security, whether they come from home or abroad. And, of course, continuing, in time and only with unanimous agreement, to welcome new countries into the EU. Now, this vision of flexibility and cooperation, it's not the same as those who want to build an ever closer political union, but it is just as valid. And if we can't persuade our European partners to share this vision for all, we certainly need to find a way to allow this vision to shape Britain's membership. So I can tell you today that as part of our renegotiation, I'm asking European leaders for a clear, legally binding and irreversible agreement to end Britain's obligation to work towards an ever closer union. That will mean Britain can never be entangled in a political union against our will or be drawn into any kind of United States of Europe. We also need to ensure that while the European Parliament plays an important role, there is a more significant role for national parliaments, including our own parliament right here in Westminster. It is national parliaments which are and will remain the main source of real democratic legitimacy and accountability inside the EU. It's to the British Parliament that I must account on the EU budget negotiations or on safeguarding our place in the single market. Those are the parliaments which instill respect, even fear, into national leaders. So it's time to give these national parliaments a greater say over EU lawmaking. Now, we're not suggesting a veto for every single national parliament. We acknowledge that in a Europe of 28, that would mean gridlock. But we want to see a new arrangement where groups of national parliaments can come together and reject European laws which are not in their national interest. We also need to address the issue of subsidiarity, the question of what is best decided in Brussels and what is best dealt with in European capitals. We believe that if powers don't need to reside in Brussels, they should automatically be returned to Westminster. So we want to see the EU's commitment to subsidiarity fully implemented, with clear proposals to achieve that. In addition, the UK will need confirmation that the EU institutions will fully respect the purpose behind the Justice and Home Affairs protocols in any future proposals dealing with justice and home affairs matters, in particular to preserve the UK's ability to choose to participate. In addition, national security is and must remain the sole responsibility of member states, while recognising the benefits of working together on issues that affect the security of us all. Now, finally, in this area, people are also frustrated by some legal judgments made in Europe that impact on life in Britain. Now, of course, this relates as much to the European Convention on Human Rights as the European Union, which is why we need to act on both fronts. So we will reform our relationship with the ECHR by scrapping Labour's Human Rights Act and introducing a new British Bill of Rights. We will, of course, consult on how to make this big constitutional change. The consultation we will publish will set out our plan to remain consistent with the founding principles of the Convention while restoring the proper role of UK courts and our Parliament. And as we reform the relationship between our courts and Strasbourg, it's also right we consider the role of the European Court of Justice and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So as was agreed at the time of the Lisbon Treaty, we will enshrine in our domestic law that the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights does not create any new rights. We'll make it explicit to our courts that they cannot use the EU Charter as the basis for any new legal challenge, citing spurious new human rights grounds. We will also examine whether we can go one step further. We need to examine the way that Germany and other EU nations uphold their constitution and sovereignty. For example, the Constitutional Court in Germany retains the right to review whether essential constitutional freedoms are respected when powers are transferred to Europe. And it also reserves the right to review legal acts by the European institutions and the courts to check that they remain within the scope of the EU's powers, or whether they've overstepped.
Well, we're going to leave this speech with David Cameron in just a moment. He's explaining, in his words, the European Union needs to change. And he's arguing that the reforms Britain is seeking in order to remain in the bloc will benefit not just Britain, but the EU as a whole. One size does not always fit all, said the British Prime Minister, pointing out that Britain, unlike many other European nations, sees the European Union as a means to an end, not an end in itself.